Welcome to the More to the Story podcast. I am so glad you have come along today. We have a great show, somebody I have heard for a while, I've listened to, I've read, and I'm thankful for the opportunity I get to a chance to engage his new book. But you're going to have to wait just a second to find out about that because I need to tell you about the sponsors of this podcast. Bill Roberts is a financial planner who comes at this discipline from a Christian perspective, and he's particularly gifted at helping people who are serving in ministry as they have to calculate funny things like housing allowances and that type of thing. But he does this with the aim of helping people plan well for their retirement. So you can check out information about Bill at williamhroberts.com, and you can find a link to him in my show notes. Also, we are brought to you by Wesley Biblical Seminary, where I work and serve as the academic dean and professor of theology and preaching. I'm so thankful that this school is riding high at this point in the where our country is and what's happening even higher institution and higher education in our world. Altogether, right now, we have one of the highest enrollments in our history, and we have students who are entering into our bachelor's, master's, and doctoral programs. We'd love for you to think about Wesley Biblical Seminary as we are training trusted leaders for faithful churches. Check us out at wbs.edu. And finally, I just want to make sure people know about a resource I have available. It is 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. It's a 45-minute teaching session that I have in an 8-page document for preachers and teachers to help them get deeper into Scripture with the aim of thinking how they communicate what they've learned better. So I'd love for you to check that out. I'll give that to you for free if you sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymillerIII.com. All right. I am glad to welcome into the podcast today, Glen Scrivener, who is the director of Speak Life. Glen, I am a fan of yours. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Andy.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Glen, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from. I think that will get people acclimated with you and understanding, like, before we get into your new book, which I'm really excited to talk about.
Well, you would say acclimated. I would say climatized, because I'm on this side of the Atlantic, and you have to get acclimated to me saying climatized, I guess. I'm from Australia originally, and I've been living for half my life in the UK now. I'm married to Emma. We've got Ruby and JJ are our 2 children. I'm an Anglican minister in the Church of England, but my day job is to work as an evangelist, and so I direct the ministry Speak Life, and we go out and preach the gospel, and we create resources that help people to understand the gospel, and we train other people to do the same. So that's Speak Life.
Now, how did you get to the UK? Was it for education purposes, or? Yeah,
my dad got a job. I was not yet 15 years old, and with about 6 weeks notice, we switched hemispheres, and
wow.
And then I went back to Australia and then back here, and then I got deported from here and then went back to Australia, and then I got married.
You got deported.
Oh yeah. Okay. There's every Australian has a story like this. But yes, I married my wife in 2003, and I've got the green card. That's not the only reason why I married her, but it certainly helps. So yeah.
Interesting. So you went through and become an Anglican minister, and but you're not necessarily like that's your ordination, but you're functioning in this with this nonprofit. Have you started this nonprofit, Speak Life?
I've changed. It began as the Hour of Revival Evangelistic Association, and just by the title, you can probably guess the decade that it was. It began in 1952, and there was very much a Billy Graham kind of evangelist at the heart of it, who went out and did the Crusades type thing, but he also had a radio ministry, and so he founded this. He founded this nonprofit as something to help us in proclaiming Jesus in person and via media. Media back in the day meant radio.
Right.
But I joined the organization in 2010, and we've been moving much more online and much more in terms of video. But we still do the same thing. We still lift up the name of Jesus in person and online.
Awesome. Love it. And that's part of what you're doing in a different way in this new book that you've published. And I just want to encourage people to get it. The Air We Breathe. Now, when people see the title, they might even pick it up. And it says, how we all came to believe, subtitle, how we all came to believe in freedom, kindness, progress, and equality. So if people see those words, they might not think they have a Christian book coming their way. So help us understand what is it? Even with this image of the air we breathe, what do you have in mind there?
Well, they've done a great job with the cover, because
oh, look at this.
If you get a hard copy, you get the cheese grater edition, in which there are holes in the cover to give you the sense of the values that we have blowing their way through the atmosphere. And I guess the illustration is based on my experience in Australia. I grew up there, as I've said, and when you're living in a place, you don't really appreciate the atmosphere. And it's only now when I fly back into Sydney, I smell how sweet the air is, because there are so many eucalyptus trees, and the eucalyptus oil is kind of mentholating the air. It's like a kind of a cough syrup, constantly carried upon the breeze.
And that's a good smell.
It's a good smell.
It's a good cough syrup. Okay, keep going.
Yeah,
eucalyptus.
Yeah, that eucalyptus menthol kind of. But it's a sweet smell that you do not notice because it is the air that you breathe. And sometimes you need to go out of the atmosphere and come back into it to figure out what you've been taking for granted the whole time. And I guess the contention of the book is that we have moral intuitions and assumptions and gut instincts that we take to be utterly natural and obvious and universal. And what the book tries to do is take you out of your current environment, maybe by going around the world, but in this book, really, we go back in history to pre-Christian times, and show people that the moral assumptions and intuitions and gut instincts that we all share are by no means natural. They are by no means obvious. They are by no means universal. They have come to us specifically from the Jesus Revolution, and so that's kind of the premise of the book.
Now, a lot of these themes then are things that would be highlighted in Western culture, and you and I both come from Western culture. And I think this is last week, the Queen, as we said, the Salvation Army is promoted to glory. She's no longer she's absent from the body, present with the Lord. But there's a highlighting at this point of Western culture, and there's a questioning of it. How much of what we're talking about here are things that are supposing, and being a little bit of a critic, supposing Western values?
Yeah, well, I'd say Western values are very contingent things. They are not these obvious moral intuitions that all humanity in all times and places have shared. And so I go through 7 different moral values that we all tend to hold in the West. I go through equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. And I actually attach those to 7 different stages in human history. With equality, I talk about the Old Testament. With compassion, I talk about Jesus in particular in the New Testament. With consent in the realm of sexual ethics, I talk about the early church. With enlightenment, I talk about the medieval period. With science, I talk about the scientific revolution. With freedom, I talk about the abolition of the slave trade. And with progress, I bring us up to date to the 21st century. And my point is really that all these values that we unthinkingly hold have come to us through very specific historical developments. And that really matters, especially you have a kind of a rupture in the life of the Commonwealth as Queen Elizabeth dies. Suddenly, what do you find? Well, you find millions of people showing up at cathedrals and singing hymns.
Yes.
And bowing to the earthly remains of Her Majesty, who is the governor of the Church of England, crossing themselves in periods of intense mourning. And that mourning is ritualized, and there is a pageantry that has Christian symbolism absolutely woven into it. And you notice that. You also notice people objecting to that, and people saying, well, what about democratic ideals, right? Or isn't this very nationalistic? Aren't we all globalists today? Or isn't this all about tradition? Aren't we all progressive today? But even in that debate, who gave you the idea that we ought to be democratic?
Right.
Who gave you the idea that we ought to be globalist? Who gave you the idea that we ought to be progressive?
Right?
And my contention in the book is, no matter on what side you land in all these different culture wars, it is Jesus who is shaping all of them.
Wow. So it's not just like they think people might think that they're moving against that tradition, but what they're actually moving toward is still a value that comes from the Christian worldview.
100%. I just received a letter from Humanists UK, which is the largest humanist organization in the United Kingdom, and it's an appeal letter looking for funds. They're very worried by this sort of renaissance in the Christian establishment. Yeah. And people going to church and people going to cathedrals. They're very worried, and they're saying, "Give us your money now. We need to fight the incursion of sort of, you know,
because of the Queen's death." Because of
the Queen's death, yeah.
Wow, interesting.
And so they're very worried about it, and which is interesting all by itself. But you read through this appeal letter, and what are the concerns? The concerns are for democratic representation. That's interesting. The concerns are the church is rich and is perceived to be powerful, and we want to speak against that. The church is perceived to be corrupt, and we want to speak against that. There are, you know, traditions that are holding us back, and we want to kind of progress towards a brighter future. And literally every single sentence is infused with a thoroughly Christian ideal. Yeah, every single one. Even humanism itself, because where do we get the idea that humans have this particular value, this sort of inviolable dignity that is given to each person equally, no matter who they are, their race, their religion, their rank? Where do we get the idea of human rights and human equality anyway? And so my contention is, even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool royalist and you believe in sacral monarchy, or you believe in absolute direct democracy, you are on either side of a culture war that is really encompassed by the Christian vision of reality. We're all hurling Bible verses at each other. We've just forgotten the references.
Wow. Interesting idea. Now, I want to drill down on some of these issues that you've brought up, these things that we experience in our culture that are connected, whether we realize it or not. Like you say, it's the air that we breathe. But I think talking about the Queen is interesting. I hope that I'll get this out in time where this is still like something that people are thinking about. I'm surprised even the way that I'm challenged by, and not challenged, but appreciative of the liturgy that's coming through, like the way that, like, the for instance, like a doctrine of the resurrection of the body is so clearly represented at multiple stages already. We haven't even had the funeral, like, in just this language is a part. And I think, unfortunately, if we would just take time to listen to what's being said, it could lead people to the place that they need to be.
And how beautiful it is that, yes, you'll have the Archbishop of Canterbury, besides the earthly remains of Her Majesty the Queen, saying, you know, in sure and certain hope of the resurrection of the dead, and pronouncing these things. But that is said by every vicar in every little parish up and down the country about every person who dies. Everyone, right? There is a real democratization, actually, about the fact that this liturgy is for everyone, and the Queen is no exception to it. So yeah, I'm a fan of liturgy, and I think there's a renaissance and a rediscovery and a retrieval of liturgy going on among a whole bunch of people, be they evangelical broadly, or be they people who are inquiring into the faith. And I'm finding that those who are most interested in the faith at the moment, more broadly, tends to gravitate towards more liturgical forms of service, which is interesting.
Now, I don't know if that's necessarily the case in the United States, but I'm really thankful if that is bringing people to faith and to Christian community in the UK. There's something, I think we still have to get over the superstar Christianity here. That's just something about our culture. But look, the deeper people can get into that language and tradition, I think, can help pull them to essential doctrine. I mean, I think talking about in the sure hope of the resurrection of our bodies, this is like something that ultimately gives people the final hope that they're looking for. And you say this kind of interesting thing in the book. You say the extraordinary impact of Christianity is seen in the fact that we don't notice it. And my hope is that what's happening, I need to be more proper with Her Majesty the Queen, is that people will notice it. People will notice what's going on. What do you hope people will notice in this period where Western values are not just being questioned or just being at least highlighted? What do you think can pull people in? Maybe it's different things, but I'm curious.
I think it's really important that we start noticing that the air that we breathe, we start noticing that we are all people of faith. My friends, a lot of my friends consider themselves to be totally post-Christian, totally secular, and they are not only not believers, they feel themselves to be incapable of faith. And in a sense, I've written my book for them because I want to show them that on a daily basis, they are living by faith, living according to these intuitions and these values that they cannot prove, they cannot demonstrate them mathematically or logically. You can't do a scientific experiment and come up with a proof for human rights. And yet my friends live in costly ways according to these ideals like compassion and equality and consent and all these things. And I just think it's so important to give people a vocabulary for faith when they have thought of themselves as incapable of it. You know, I think of a friend who wrote to me and just she said just one sentence of course you realize I could never be a person of faith.
Interesting.
And it's a sentence that's haunted me because I know that she lives sacrificially for the sake of values that she cannot prove.
Yeah.
And what do you call that when someone sort of wages their life on something that is not demonstrable, but in trust, they venture forth in order to be compassionate to somebody who might, you know, turn their back on them, treat somebody equally who has not yet demonstrated that they are worthy of equal dignity, you know?
Yeah.
And yet I just think it's so important because we lived for a while in the wake of the new atheism in which Richard Dawkins could kind of characterize, you know, people of faith as faith heads. And I think certainly a lot of my friends and a lot of my generation bought into that lie that we are not ordinarily people of faith. And there are those, that other breed of person over there, these Christians who manage to be able to take a leap of faith. And the whole point of the book is saying you don't need to leap. You're already 6 miles in the air.
Wow.
You're living in this castle in the air with absolutely no foundations apart from Jesus.
Yes.
Really,
so what's your strategy? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. What's your strategy with your friend? How do you respond to her?
To point out to where she already believes. And I think that's so important in all kinds of evangelism is there is a way of responding to the words that are coming out of a person's mouth. And I guess that's very important. There's also a way of addressing the heart that has given rise to those words. And that's really important. And it's also very important to point to the feet of your friend and where they are standing.
Okay.
Because what they are standing on and how they are, what the assumptions that they are making about humanity and how life works and highest ideals, those assumptions go unremarked upon. They go unexamined for most people most of the time. And so my big point is, look, my friends, they think of the church as unequal. Instead of it being compassionate, it's cruel. Instead of it being consensual, it's coercive. Instead of being enlightened, it's unenlightened. Instead of being science, it's anti-science. Instead of being free, it's about restriction. Instead of progress, it's regressive. And I just want to point out to my friends, what are you assuming? Even as you accuse the church of being these things, and we can wear those critiques because sometimes they are right on target. Yeah. But the point is, again, is not so much to take the words that are coming out of their mouth, but to point to where they're standing. And where they are standing is on the absolute rock solid assumption that equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress are foundational values that ought to be honored.
Yes.
So you're already a person of faith. Where does that come from? And then a lot of the book is showing really none of this makes sense without Jesus.
So let's get into one of these topics because you've mentioned them several times, and I know if we want to look into all of them, get the book, right? But let's look at equality, for instance. Like, and you said like a lot of people would assume that that's not what Christianity supposes. That's not what. But how is equality rooted in Christianity?
One of the things you need to do is, again, take yourself out of the atmosphere that you're used to and place yourself in a non-Christian or a pre-Christian culture. And you can do that in the ancient world. And you can ask Plato or Aristotle, are people equal? And he would say, well, obviously not. You take any two people and you judge them according to any one metric, and they're going to be different. this guy is smarter than that guy. This guy's stronger than that guy. This guy's wealthier than that guy. This guy's more economically productive than this guy. This guy is a master. That guy's a slave. This guy's a citizen. That guy's a barbarian. This guy is a guy. This guy is a girl. And Plato would be saying on every single measure, there is difference, and it leads to inequality. And then Plato would say, if you were somehow beamed back into the 5th century BC, and, he would say, you seem to believe in equality. In what sense are those two people equal? Where is that? It seems a magical idea.
Yeah.
And where has it come from? Well, page 1 of the Bible, you've got man and woman in the image of God, sharing dominion over the world. Now, that idea of the image of God was in some ancient Near Eastern texts applied to the king. Maybe the king is this godlike person, because the gods of the ancient Near East were tyrannical kind of despots. Yeah. And so, a tyrannical despot is probably a good image of a king in so many ancient Near Eastern texts. But in the Bible, everyone, male and female, is kingly, is royal. And we share that equality, no matter our gender, our race, our wealth, our class. It doesn't matter. It's entirely equal. And then you bring it through into the New Testament, and what does Jesus do? God the Son becomes God our brother, and descends to the bottom of the sort of the social hierarchy, as it were, to die the slave's death, and then rises up again to invite us into his family. And in his family, there are no lords except him. We are all brothers and sisters. It's a remarkably egalitarian vision for human worth and dignity. And it has very slowly but surely bedded itself down in our imaginations, such that now we think justice is about equalizing people. If you see an inequality, it's instinctive to us that inequality must be unfair, because equality must be achieved. And so justice involves equalizing people. Whereas you talk to a Plato or an Aristotle, and inequality, they would say, is woven into creation, woven into the nature of things. And justice means enforcing that inequality, right? And what's happened? There's been the most extraordinary revolution in our moral compass, and it's all down to Jesus. It really is.
So this then gets connected to slavery. So a lot of people would say, "Oh, Christianity, just enables slavery to happen for a long time." But I mean, how is the equality and the slavery question connected?
Well, again, Plato or Aristotle would say, nature teaches you. Some people are born to rule, and some people are born to be ruled over. And if you leave aside your Christianity and you try to go toe-to-toe with Plato on that question, you'll probably lose. Not just because he's far cleverer than you are, far cleverer than I am, but it is obvious to him that when you look at some people, they're very good at organizing their own lives. And there are some people who are terrible at organizing their own lives. And wouldn't it be good if the people who are good at organizing others organized them, and the people who are not good at organizing themselves got looked after in that way? It sounds very rational, and there's no logical flaw in that argument. There's nothing logical about Homo sapiens that means you cannot have a slave class. And every single society that's gotten to any kind of level of development has been a slave society. Every single one. We are the odd ones. We are the odd ones. How are we the odd ones? Well, I talk about it in my chapter on freedom. But remarkably, there are a bunch of people who take the image of God very, very seriously and preach. And not only preach, but actually put into practice their belief in the equality of all people. And you get an abolition movement in the 18th and 19th centuries, which overturned one of the great human universals in human history, which is slavery. And we have gone, here's another revolution. We have gone from slavery being the great human universal, to the assumption that, of course, people can never be property. Of course. Well, that, of course, is so obvious to us. It is the air that we breathe. But again, it has come to us very specifically through the Jesus Revolution.
Yes. And obviously, like we say, this comes through the Jesus Revolution, but there also is this idea, too, that it's connected, as you said, to the first page of the Bible. How do we kind of work through the way that, like you say, that it finds its, I don't know if you say climax in Jesus, but how does this relate like to the reality that Christianity comes from Judaism?
Right. Well, Jesus, the King of the Jews, the Jewish Messiah, embodies the Hebrew expectations and hopes. He is the Lord of the Old Testament. He comes. What happens in the New Testament is not really a change of regime or a change in God's desires or morality or anything of the sort, but what had been kept within Old Testament Israel bursts the banks of the Jewish nation and ends up flooding the world, which is why the New Testament, it never really has to go into much doctrine in the New Testament in terms of, so as the New Testament unfolds, what does the death of Jesus mean? The New Testament will just say, well, just read Leviticus, just think about the temple some more, just think about Isaiah. It will take you back to the Old Testament in terms of those doctrines. But the big controversy in the New Testament is always, what do we do with Gentiles wanting to come in on the Jewish Messiah? Do they have to become Jewish?
Right.
And of course, if the answer to that question was yes, then I think the Jesus Revolution would be contained and locked up continually within an ethnic national group. But the genius of the New Testament is
right.
The mystery that was kept hidden for ages and is now revealed, as Paul talks about it in a number of different places. For instance, Ephesians chapter 3 and Colossians chapter 1. It is Colossians chapter 2. He says, "Is Christ in you, the hope of glory?" And in you Colossians, you in Turkey, you are in on this. You are children of Abraham as well. So I guess what you see in the Old Testament is a whole bunch of people who had these peculiar views. They believed in compassion and equality and consent and all these great values. Right. But it was locked up. In the New Testament, it burst the banks of Old Testament Israel, and it's flooded the world.
Yeah, through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed.
Blessed. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a bigger vision. Okay. Now you bring up the other one. I thought it's so interesting that you highlight consent as something. Yeah. So talk to me about that. Like, how is that coming from the Christian tradition? How is that a part of, like people are generally going to assume that, yeah, of course, this is something that we all, I mean, I think the word that keeps coming up like time and time again is of course. Well, how do we get to that? Of course. And particularly, how's that related to like kind of like the history of consent?
Yeah. Oh gosh, such a big topic. But the sexual ethics of the Greco-Roman world is just night and day from what we would take for granted. A highborn Roman male had the right to possess any body he so chose, be they in his family, be they a slave, be they a prostitute. Prostitution was state-sponsored. Brothels were everywhere. A trip to the brothel would set you back the cost of a loaf of bread. There are 25 Latin words for prostitute. Whoa. And yet there is no natural way in Latin to refer to an adult male virgin. When you say virgin, when you say virgin in Latin, you're referring to a woman. It's just assumed.
Yeah,
there's no natural grammatical way of referring to an adult male virgin. Right?
Oh my goodness! I mean, it sounds like the way people talk about we are Wesley Biblical Seminary is in Jackson, Mississippi, which is where the case that went to the Supreme Court where Roe versus Wade was overturned. But so often in the discussions about abortion is this assumption that sounds like people are just going to get pregnant. People are just going to have sex outside of the boundaries of marriage between one man and one woman. I mean, it's just going to happen. Now we just have to deal with it. I mean, so it sounds like it's similar to that time period.
I just finished reading a book by Louise Perry called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And she's not a Christian.
Interesting.
But she opens her book with a little snatch of conversation that a friend of hers had with an archaeologist. And the archaeologist came home from a long day of digging, and he said, "We found another brothel." And this friend of Louise Perry said, "How do you know it's a brothel?" He said, "Because of all the baby bones."
Oh my.
Massive burial sites of babies is an indicator there was a brothel. Why?
Wow.
Well, because we all know where sex leads, and certainly before the pill, that is definitely where sex would lead. And yet the prostitutes would have the children, and then their master would, force them to commit infanticide, which again is another human universal.
Right.
Or, it's very difficult to find human cultures that don't practice infanticide. Of course, we find that abhorrent.
Yes.
It was invisible to them as a problem.
Wow. I'm sorry to get you off. You were talking about consent, and I was kind of blown away by this idea that there isn't a word for male virgins.
Yeah, well, it is all linked. It is all linked in that the unquestioned rights of powerful men to do what they want with their libidos. Of course, it was not mirrored back in the female experience.
Right.
There was a word for virgin, and it just meant woman. And absolute chastity was expected of women. Virginity before marriage, and then complete faithfulness within marriage. They probably wouldn't have to wait long until marriage. Marriages at 12 were very common in the Roman world. And so there was this incredible inequality. And then the sexual revolution happened. And when I say the sexual revolution, you're probably thinking the 1960s. But 1900 years before the swinging 60s, the real sexual revolution that has been for the absolute blessing of this world was Jesus standing up, Matthew chapter 19, and saying, "It's one man, one woman for life, and that's that." And these red-blooded men who are following Jesus say, if it's like this, it's probably better if we don't get married. So some of Jesus' followers were married, so I don't know what their wives thought about their husbands, saying it's probably better if we didn't get married, Jesus. But then Jesus says, there's one other option. You can be a eunuch for the kingdom, right? You can forswear all sexual relations for the sake of Christ and his kingdom. And that's it. And fascinatingly, what that sexual revolution does is absolutely equalize the sexes. There's no more double standard. Men cannot sow their wild oats and then expect women to be chaste. Men and women are to be utterly chaste and devoted to Christ, and there's only one sexual outlet, and that is marriage. But that has been for the absolute blessing of the world. Another non-Christian, Joseph Henrich, he wrote a book called The Weirdest People in the World, and he traced through why Westerners are so bizarre historically and internationally. And he says it's because of Christianity, and in particular because of the sexual ethic of Christianity. He calls it the marriage and family program. And he said absolutely, he uses this phrase about the church reaching down and grabbing men by the testicles, right? Which is a particularly vulgar way of putting it, but he's basically saying constrain your sexuality, and it's not a million miles away from Jesus saying be a eunuch for the kingdom, right? And the Christian sexual ethic tamed rampant male sexuality, because rampant male sexuality in the wild is such a destructive thing. It leads to all these brothels, and it leads to all these cemeteries full of these tiny little children who the fathers have no connection to, and then they move on. Marriage ties a man to his partner and to his children, ties a man to his sexual choices in a way that biology doesn't. Biology ties a woman to her sexual choices. Biology doesn't tie a man to his sexual choices. We need culture to do that. We need marriage to do that. And the imposition of Jesus' sexual ethic was absolutely for the blessing and flourishing of the world. Joseph Henrich, talks about how the West is particularly prosperous because of this. I mean, he's an evolutionary biologist, so everything comes down to sex and reproduction for him. And I think it's a little bit reductionistic, his analysis of these things. But he cannot get away from the fact that the sexual revolution of the first century was transformative. And And it brings consent into the bedroom, because it's got to be a man and a woman. And in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says, a man's body doesn't belong to him, it belongs to his wife, and his wife's body belongs to her. And that mutuality, and you should only come together by consent, and you should only forswear sex by consent, to devote yourself to prayer and then come back again. And so he brings equality into the bedroom. He brings consent into the bedroom. He brings commitment into the bedroom in a way that has been utterly for the blessing of the world. And I think the undoing of that first century sexual revolution is not for our blessing.
And that's what's happening, of course, in society right now, is that we had laws that and institutions that were recognized. I say that really specifically, say like marriage is, as a pre-political institution, is recognized by government for the good of society. And I think that that's what's often missed. It's like not the reason that Christians and traditions like mine would want to like encourage people to not live outside of God's boundaries. It's not because we're trying to push the Bible on you. It's like we ultimately want the best thing for society as a whole. And that involves children and the way and how a society is formed around the union between a man and a woman. My fear is like we're moving away from all of these distinctions. Most Western societies are. And I feel like we're almost in a place where, and this might seem a negative view, that we have to let society go and realize how good we had it with these rules. Like it's almost going to have to cave in on itself in order for us to see that this basis for understanding how we function with understanding of consent, but also within the boundaries that Jesus recognized as a foundation for what we're going to do. We're almost in a long game at this point.
That's what's been great about doing this book, is recognizing what a very long game the Christian Revolution truly has been. And, so many of our brothers and sisters down through history have lived under regimes that define sex and marriage in ways that are utterly antithetical to the Bible. And many of them have absolutely thrived. Not necessarily having their beliefs reflected, on the statute books. Right. But I think we have to be the sort of communities that are open to the refugees that are coming from the sexual revolution. And there are so many refugees from the sexual revolution. There have been all sorts of disastrous of the 1960s. I'm thinking about. Yeah. There have been so many disastrous consequences for children and our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of gender, and I think we need to be ready for those refugees. And
thinking of them as refugees is helpful, right? I mean, that's what's that's where we're going to be very quickly when you talk about 10, 15 years from now, when somebody who decided to, take their bodies and manipulate them in ways and hurt them. I mean, we need to be ready for the pastoral response to caring for refugees.
And I think there's a lot of hope. When I read Louise Perry's book, I've gotten to know her a little bit personally as well. And she's on a really interesting journey in terms of how she's thinking about these things. She worked in a rape crisis center where she learnt two things, really. And for 10 years, she was working in an environment in which she recognized that sex is very meaningful, and you realize how meaningful it is when it goes wrong. And that gender is really, really, really important. And then she read another book that was somewhat of an inspiration for my book, Dominion by Tom Holland,
right,
where he talks about the Me Too movement as something that is a profoundly Christian thing. Because what do you call a Harvey Weinstein in Rome? You'd call him a senator. Like Harvey Weinstein is the problem of Harvey Weinstein is invisible to an ancient person. It only makes sense within a broadly Christian kind of understanding of things. And she is pulling at that thread, and she's right. She's just written a book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, where chapters are things like marriage is good, men and women are different, sex is significant, listen to your mother. It's kind of, and lots of people are waking up to it. I think there is an opportunity if we don't kind of sell the farm,
right,
and jump with both feet into this sexual revolution. If we plant our feet firmly on the good sexual revolution that's for the flourishing of the world, and do not lose our nerve, I think we'll see so many people sympathetic to our cause. And
Amen.
Actually, she is representative of so many people who are finding the sexual ethic of Jesus their way in. We're so used to thinking the sexual ethic of Jesus is in the West. That's and that's the thing that we just need to. Can we just park that question? I just want to talk about Jesus and the resurrection, and maybe we'll get onto the sexual ethic.
Interesting.
Lots of people are. It's their way in. They're seeing that simply to believe in man and woman is you're called a phobe for that. You're called a bigot for that. This is somehow genocide. Just talking about man and women. Loads of people are witnessing that, and they're starting to see. We called the church bigoted. We called the church homophobic. But J.K. Rowling's not bigoted. J.K. Rowling's not homophobic. Maybe the church isn't either. And I'm seeing it as a pathway for lots of people to start getting interested in Jesus again.
Basically, the apologetic task might be one to go towards these distinctions that are self-evident, right, between male and female as a way to get in, as opposed to all of the hard work we've done in defending the resurrection, even though I want to do that as well at the same time.
Right. Yeah.
It's such an interesting, and I think it's so clear. I think as we see people responding to the transgender revolution, like for instance, I think it became so clear on social media when there was a NCAA swimmer who's 6 feet tall and is definitely like has a completely different build than the second and third place people that were beat that she beat in that moment. So it's such an interesting thing. Like that's a way in. Now you said something just a minute ago. We can't sell the farm on this. We can't. We have to kind of hold to this original sexual revolution. What is a way that Christians could sell the farm? What are some ways?
Well, I think the world is noticing that it is impossible to have gender neutral people, that we are sexed. We are either male or female. But I see that as somewhat of an end point for those who had earlier thought of marriage is gender neutral. Marriage is not sexed. It does not matter if you have man and woman, or if you have two husbands, or you have two wives. And I think there is absolutely a link between the error of saying a human is gender neutral and the error of saying that a marriage is gender neutral. And I think one way Christians have and can sell the farm is by giving up on what Matthew 19 makes clear from the beginning. God made them, the creator made them male and female. But once you stand on that, I think you can look historically and you can say, look, male-female monogamy as the heartbeat of society has absolutely been for the blessing of the world, and it's brought the greatest equality. Giving it up, like with the case of Leah Thomas, that swimmer, brings back male domination. It really, this is not for your liberation. This is not for the cause of equality. It's really not. It in so many ways, it suits men. I mean, the sexual revolution of the 1960s absolutely has suited men, and its current kind of iteration in kind of trans ideology utterly suits men and has seen erasure of female spaces it is not. It has not been for our blessing and our good. So why don't we just go back to the original sexual revolution? Let's go back to the original. Matthew 19 is fascinating because Jesus says, there's male and female in the beginning. The two shall become one, and what God has joined together, let no one separate. And then he does talk about like it's my gender identity, if you like, is very different. There are some who are born eunuchs. Right.
So interesting.
Right. It's not okay. There are these marginal cases. There are these difficult cases. And Jesus is not kind of eradicating or erasing the identity of those who find either their gender or their sexuality difficult. To be honest, I think we all do. But there is something good about submitting to what is already a given. Male and female is already a given. We all find it difficult to live into that. Marriage is this given. We all find it difficult to live into that. And if we don't do that, singleness is a given. And we find it difficult to live in that season as well, however long that season might be in a person's life. It might be the whole of their lives. But it's about just trusting that Jesus knows what he's talking about.
Yes.
And the guy who has actually built your world, he's founded civilizations. He predicted all of this 2,000 years ago, and it's come true. Maybe we can just trust him on this. That's what it boils down to, I guess.
I love it. This is such a different type of argument. Glenn, thank you so much for making it so clearly. And also it's just a great way into conversation. I hope that this will encourage people to do that. Now, we've talked about consent, equality, sexuality, but we're also, you have a chapter on science. And generally people think of science and Christianity or faith being at odds. How is this a part? How, like, even just our understanding of science, how much is that a part of this air that we breathe?
Yeah. Well, ever since the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, a couple of very significant and influential polemical works were published about the warfare between Christianity and science. And we kind of like that story. We like the story where, let's say, a Galileo pursues academic and intellectual freedom, and there's a big baddie called the Pope. Boo, hiss, the Pope. And the Pope comes along and he says, no science, I hate science. And Galileo, what a hero. He says, I don't care what you say. I will, stand for truth no matter what. And he is found vehemently suspect of heresy, and he's imprisoned for the rest of his days. But he was right. And the truth will out, and the scientific revolution has proved what a baddie that religious figure the Pope was. Okay, that's an interesting story. We love that story. We resonate with that story.
Right.
Because a century earlier, there was this other guy, and he stood up against a Pope. And he said, I don't care what you say. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. And his name was Martin Luther. And he birthed this Protestant Reformation. And he's often called like this guy who stands between the times. He was the last of the ancient, last of the medieval people and the first modern man, because on sense of conscience and the sense of what he knew to be true, he didn't care what the Pope said. He didn't care what the emperor said. He didn't care what tradition said. He stood up again. And those nasty religious people, they tried to kill him, but he stuck to his guns, and the truth proved him victorious, and we're all Protestants now. So isn't it interesting that the Galileo story resonates with the people who have been shaped by the Martin Luther story? Well, okay, why does the Martin Luther story kind of resonate with us? Well, there was this guy, and he stood up against the religious powers and authorities, right?
Yeah.
And no matter what the forces arrayed against him were, no matter whether it was Pontius Pilate or whether it was Herod, whether it was the Pharisees, whether it was the Sadducees, he was the truth, and they killed him. They actually did kill him. And yet the truth won. And the light chased away the darkness, and religious authorities were revealed for the corrupt institutions that they were, and Jesus birthed a new kingdom. See, that's the original story that we love. And that's why the Martin Luther story resonates with us. It's also why the Galileo story resonates with us. And then by the time you get to Thomas Jefferson, let me see if I can get the quote. He said, priests fear the advent of science as witches fear the rising of the sun. And it's
wow. I'll let you find it there. I'll give you an example of this from my own research. So I'm a 6 generations into the Salvation Army. My family came to the United States through the ministry of the Salvation Army, but often like this is I call it William Booth had a more or less ecclesiology. Like he's pretty much, the Salvation Army is pretty much more or less a church. And even though he would say, we're not a church, we're not seeking to be a church. Everything about what they did was functioning as a church. It's like a paradox of sorts. But there's a way that often the arguments were made that the Salvation Army, or in any new movement, like your movement, Speak Life, we're going to be more than other evangelistic agencies. Now, I'm not saying that you've said that, but Salvation Army, certainly in our founding days, said we're more than other churches or other. And so what was often would happen is that William Booth would be positioned as this same sort of, I mean, they would say it, the exact same lines, like the Apostle Paul, people talking about him, like the Apostle Paul, like Martin Luther, like just go down the list of all the heroes. So William Booth stood up against the Sanhedrin of the the Methodist New Connection Conference, you know, like, and that was kind of like the way that we want to position ourselves to be in that same sort of tradition. So, okay, did you find the quote?
I did. Okay.
It
reminds me of another quote that I use in the book is that we are attuned to the Christ story. When we find a Christ figure, it hums like a tuning fork.
Amen.
It just resonates. But Thomas Jefferson said, "Priests dread the advance of science as witches do the approach of daylight." It's just brilliant line. But again, it's this idea of the scientists are in this Christ position.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, religion is arrayed against it, trying to shackle the sun, these fools who are going to be overturned by the scientific revolution. But of course, as a story, it resonates with us. But let's be good scientists. We've got our hypothesis. Let's test it against the evidence. Let's look at the data and let's see if our hypothesis might need revising. And when you go back to the scientific revolution, or I call it an evolution in the book, it is not the case that breaking away from the church led to science. It is precisely that natural philosophers at Christian institutions called universities, according to a specifically Christian form of philosophy and study of the natural world, overturned the Greek, the Hellenistic, the Aristotelian views of science, and brought about a scientific revolution that did away with actually the older, the older paradigms, and it did so as Christians at Christian institutions studying the natural world for Christian reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And all of them, including Galileo and Copernicus and Kepler and Newton and all these guys, were profoundly Christian people for whom the image of God was absolutely fundamental to why they did science. Because what you have with the image of God is the solution to a real mystery. The mystery is, why does science work? Why does Homo sapiens, like clinging to this insignificant rock, hurtling around the sun in the unfashionable western end of the one spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy, why does 3 pounds of gray matter between these two ears have any chance of plumbing the mysteries of the cosmos? Why? And actually, the image of God gives you the solution to that, because what science depends on is that there are laws up above, there's a world out there, and there's my mind in here, and I can somehow look out at the world there and plug it into theories about the laws up above. And there's a triangulation between laws up above, minds in here, and the world out there. Why should that triangulate? The image of God tells you why. On page 1 of the Bible, we're told that humanity are in this privileged position of being under heaven, but having dominion over the earth. And so we are, to some degree, able to grasp some of the mysteries of the cosmos. And it was people who believed in that who ended up doing science. And as C.S. Lewis famously said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. They expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator.
Mm-hmm.
And it was precisely the Christian church that gave rise to the scientific revolution. So we need a hypothesis about science and religion that can handle the actual data, because the actual data is that science is one more gift of the Jesus revolution.
Awesome. We don't have too much time, Kai. I've already taken a lot of your time, but I'm interested to the idea of progress. Like, generally, this is thought of like people want to move away from Christianity to achieve progress. But I'm interested to think about, like, what does progress look like when Christianity is removed from the equation?
Right. And I talk about a lot of very despotic visions of progress. So Chairman Mao, for instance, under his great leap forward in the 1940s and 50s, oversaw the deaths of tens of millions, but perhaps 45 million died in Chairman Mao's great leap forward. So that should give us real pause for thought whenever anyone says progress is simply a good thing. You can say the same about Stalin's 5-year plans. You could say the same about any number of human beliefs that come on board my train. I am heading towards progress. Well, how do you know? So, yeah, not all ideas about progress are equal, but we have got the sense that Martin Luther King Jr. Gave to us. He was quoting an abolitionist preacher from the 19th century when he said that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That kind of resonates with us. Why does that resonate with us? Well, Martin Luther King and then the preacher that he was citing would go back to the prophets, actually. And justice will roll on like a river and a never-failing stream, and the beating of swords into plowshares, and there will come this time. And of course, Jesus talks about his movement will be like a mustard seed that's the smallest of all seeds, but it will become the greatest plant, and even the birds of the air will perch in its branches. Or it's like yeast working its way through a batch of dough. Or a couple of chapters later in Matthew 16, Jesus says, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. And that's interesting because gates do not advance. The church advances.
Yeah,
and we plunder Satan's kingdom. And that's what we have been doing for the last 20 centuries. So there is a sense of progress. And as it turns out, we now take for granted some of the values of the kingdom, including equality and compassion, consent, and those things. So this first century prophet got his prophecy. He nailed it. He was indeed proved to be a true prophet in that sense. So there is a kind of progress, but who's in charge of that progress?
Yeah.
If you put human beings in charge of that progress, well, it's very simple for me to say I'm on the right side of history. Well, how do you know? How do you know?
Right.
And then history just becomes this kind of cudgel that you bludgeon other people with. You need to be able to leave the future in God's hands and entrust yourself to Christ's kingdom, in which he will be victorious and the gates of hell will not prevail. And I do believe in that kind of progress. But you're absolutely right to be suspicious of people who simply believe in human progress, because we have not simply been promised this abstract train towards progress town.
Yeah, interesting. This is such an interesting book. And Glenn, thank you so much for taking time to write it. And I love how it comes out of your experience as an evangelist. Like, this is ultimately like a way I think you're trying to get in to serve people, to help them come to Jesus. And it's a different angle, and it's a different type of apologetic. And I find it to be creative and helpful. And I love how you've been able to use resources that come from people like Tom Holland, Rodney Stark. But I think this book has a real great opportunity in front of it. Like, I really trust that God's going to use it. Now, before we finish up, I always ask a question. My podcast is called More to the Story. And there's a theological reason behind that. Like, I want people to realize there's more than just having your sins forgiven. There's the process and experience of sanctification. But also, I like to find out if there's more to the story of Glen Scrivener. So was there something you don't often get to share? Like, you're often sharing different things here. I mean, you told us a little about where you're from. I mean, is there a hobby you have that you don't talk a lot about?
I'll pick up a guitar any chance I get. I love playing along. Got a whole bunch of songs. One of these days, the world might hear them. But
okay, so you've written some songs.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
So one of these days, there's more to the story, Andy. But
okay, I'm looking for it. Yeah, that's great. Anything else you want to say, or anything I should have asked you?
No, that's all fantastic. And if people want to join us at Speak Life, we do offer actually internships over here at Speak Life. People can come to us for 1 or 2 years. We can sort out American visas. We've had about 4 U.S. interns over the last 3 years, and we love to see.
Tell me,
people.
What would they do? What would interns do if they spent a year or two with you?
You spend some time with me and with my other evangelist, Nate Morgan-Locke, and we preach around the place. We produce a lot of media together. We've got a large kind of video ministry. And then there's a lot of training. We do a kind of a Bible overview, and we talk about the intersection of creativity and Christian evangelism. So people would be really welcome to check us out at speaklife.org.uk.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks so much for your time, Glenn. Appreciate your ministry, your writing ministry, and the work God's called you to do. We appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Andy.